This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. And today, as we get to the end of the allium season, I just wanted to do a recap of varieties that have flowered from May until now in early August. And if you're an allium fanatic, as I am, and I'll explain why I am in a minute, it just gives you a really nice succession. And I'm just moving on to working on a new book, actually. And one of the things that it's going to focus on is colour, no surprise there, but also on this idea of succession of colour. So that if you're a colour addict, what you can do to ensure your garden has something colourful really all the way through from sort of ideally mid-Feb until mid-November. And alliums really play such an important role in that. And how I think of it is it's like they're in a relay race, and I'll talk more about this in a later episode, but they're in a relay race where they're handing the colour baton from one species to another without dropping it. And that is literally how I think of it. And that's why I thought I would name, I think it's 12 varieties of allium. I could be wrong there, I haven't counted them actually, but that will really ensure that you have one of these crazy sparklers in your garden all the way through from when the last tulip drops its petals in the middle of May to when the first dahlia opens its petals, its flowers, sort of end of July, beginning of August. So let's talk about which ones do which. But actually, before we do, let's just think about why. So some people don't like alliums, and there is one very good reason to not like alliums, and I totally get this, which is that their foliage is super tatty. By the time the flowers come, the foliage has started to die back from the tip, and it's brown and it's pretty ugly. But weirdly, that is in a way quite a bonus because you can cut the foliage back and leave these wonderful sparkler firework displays without the foliage, making it even kind of more dramatic in a sense. And why can you do that? It's because alliums are one of the first things to emerge. Their foliage is in February, in early spring, late winter. Up it comes. You'll know it with your chives. They're one of the first herbaceous perennial herbs that poke up in the garden, but it's true of all alliums. And the foliage emerges really, really early on. Why is that an advantage? Well, because it's there photosynthesizing for the whole of March, for the whole of April. Some will flower in May, but some don't flower till June. So it's been there photosynthesizing, storing more food back in the bulb for 3 or 4 months before the demands of flowering. What does that mean? Makes them super perennial. So unlike a tulip, that's foliage comes up often 3 or 4 weeks before the flower, then the flower comes and then it starts to die back. So it's on this incredibly short time frame of maybe 8 weeks, and it's got to store enough back into its bulb in that time. Well, of course, some of them don't. If conditions aren't perfect, that won't happen. And so they're not very hugely perennial, depending on variety, but they're not hugely perennial. Whereas alliums are super perennial. And I've planted certain alliums here, certainly 30 years ago in the garden, and they come back year on year. I don't want self-seeders because I don't want alliums taking over everywhere. And I do love Purple Sensation, but it is a self-seeder. But I adore Christophii, I adore Schubertii. I'm going to talk about these. And they do not self-seed. So they're well-behaved, but they are very perennial. And so that bit of money that you spend in autumn will be replenishing your joy cup, so to speak, will be really cheering you up in your garden for decades to come. And for me, that is just, that's a really good thing. So let's have a talk through varieties. The first to flower in the garden here, of the showy ones this is, so I'm not going to talk about the sort of more diminutive ones like Kawanii and stuff, which are very pretty, but these are the showy, come on, look at me ones. So the first is Purple Sensation. And I've already talked about it. I love it. It's incredibly good value. The bees absolutely love it, but it is a self-seeder. And when it seeds, Purple Sensation, which is a deep black currant purple, turns a little bit more mauvey. It reverts to its parent, Allium hollandicum, quite often. And I don't like that quite as much as the pure, true Purple Sensation. And when it seeds, you will get a mix of those two. So sort of the bold sweet purple and the more mauvey purple. But Purple Sensation is the first one we have lots of here. But it coincides with Allium Purple Rain. Now, this is more airy. It gives you less of a dense purple globe. It's more airy, and that's because Purple Sensation has been crossed with Christophii. I think that's right. And you have much more of a sparkler effect. So you can actually see the individual florets stems. But I rather love that. And also it gives you a bigger sparkler, a bigger dome, a bigger globe. So that for me is another real winner. And we have Purple Rain in the farmhouse garden here because it's a gentler purple. And we have Purple Sensation, which is real bold sweet in our bold sweet garden, which is the Oast garden here. Anyway, this year we've got on trial a new variety, which looks rather like Purple Rain, but it's on a 30 centimetre stem. And when I first saw it, it's called Powder Puff, by the way. When I first saw it, I wasn't sure, but then I realised actually for a container, that would be amazing because it's not too top heavy. The proportion is actually rather good. And in fact, in a vase, it's rather amazing for the same reason. So you don't have a great length of stem and then the globe on top. It sort of feels a more natural proportion, more like Christophii, in fact, which I'm coming on to, but that flowers a tiny bit later. So the last one for May is a variety which is called Allium bulgaricum, used to be called Nectascordum bulgaricum. My parents have this in their garden, and it is a prolific seeder. I love it, but you have to be a little bit careful with it. It's the most favoured by bees. It will grow in dappled shade, even quite dark shade, so it's useful for that. But you just have to be a little bit careful. So I would say, once it's flowered, I would try and get in there quick and remove all the seed heads before they spread, if you possibly can, because it will take over a bit otherwise. But it is the one that is busiest with bees, really, throughout May and into June. It is the most pungent. So it's got these rather trendy, brownish, kind of almost cafe au lait, La Belle Epoque coloured bells. But it is quite oniony in smell, just as a tiny word of warning. So then on to June. So from May into June, I think, any garden would be less without Allium Christophii. It doesn't have the H in it, like without Christopher, it's just Christophii. It's a bargain. It's not expensive, and it's been coming back, as I mentioned, in the garden here for 30 years at least, more and more, but not too much. It's not invasive at all. And it forms the most fantastic, really big, airy, crazy sparklers, just like a sort of firework display. It's just one of the greatest. And it's really, really good value. Newer in breeding, there's a whole new family that also flower in June, which are just coming out at the moment. And there used to be one that was called Hair. And I don't know if it's the same or it's very similar, but there's a new one that we've got on trial called Art. And they look tall, almost like a very fine leek, but at the top, they have this crazy small globe with a punk's hairdo, a sort of spiky hairdo coming out the top of this circle, of this globe. So they're really unusual. And in a flower arrangement, I find those rather amazing because they are properly eccentric. So for June, that's gone on to my favourites list, really. I think it's so unusual for shape that I love it. And then moving from June into July, we move into the Schubertii varieties coming out. And these are the biggest of all. So these can form the size of a football, at least, even a football and a third. And they're almost totally round. They sometimes have a more flat base, but sometimes the florets actually point almost back onto the stem. So they literally form a proper sphere. And the one I've got in front of me here is a new variety called Arctic Snow. And it's white, not surprisingly with that name. And we have it in the farmhouse garden where we have lots of white. And it came up last year for the first time. Josie and I had obviously found it in a trial and I'd completely forgotten it. And I was just so excited by it because it just looks like, I don't know, like the Star of Bethlehem or something. I mean, it's a very, very glamorous, very airy, very elegant, very showy thing. And I'll come on to its brother, Schubertii, in a bit. But Arctic Snow is a bit of a winner, I'd say. Very perennial, so we planted it 3 years ago only, but I reckon there are definitely a few more this year. So it seems happy in sun or dapple shade and really, really just so showy. And then smaller, but also showy and a little bit crazy, and I love crazy flowers, is a variety called Magic. And I think it must be called Magic because it has slightly unusual stems which twist and turn. They straighten as they begin to go over, but when they first emerge, you can have kind of, honestly, like sort of croquet hoops, but always heading to the sun, so heading upwards. But they have these lovely twists and turns in the stem, which when you put them in the vase, again, almost look like sort of party poppers coming out. Yeah, I love them. So smaller heads, about the size of Purple Sensation or a little bit bigger, in a dark crimson, black and purple. And they flower for ages. And that's why they start to flower early in the summer, but they really are still looking okay. I mean, they're beginning to seed now in August, but they've looked really good since late May, I'd say. So they're very, very long lasting. Final months, as we go from July into August, there are two worth mentioning that hang in there. The first is Summer Drummer, which looks in the garden almost like a cultivated leek. It will get 10 foot high, and at the top is a classic allium sphere, but they dry brilliantly. And so those spheres are standing 10 foot high in your garden well into the autumn. And so they give you these lovely vertical emphasis, which I miss once autumn comes along, because you've lost your foxgloves, you've lost your Eremerus, you haven't got those vertical lines so much. So I find Allium Summer Drummer really, really useful for that in terms of design. And Sphaerocephalon, of course, totally the other end of the size spectrum, only maybe 40 centimetres, so sort of just over a foot in height, with little drumstick. It's called the drumstick allium, and it's that kind of scale. So I'm just, the flowers of those would fit in the middle of the palm of your hand easily enough. And they do self-seed and look almost like chives, but again, very easy to control. So just harvest the seed heads before they ripen, and then you can control them really easily. So Sphaerocephalon, which means round head, of course, is the last one that we have in the garden here, along with Summer Drummer. And then, before I finish on alliums, it's incredibly important, of course, to remember these are just as good in winter as they are in summer. And now that is why I'm doing the podcast in August, is it's now when the seed heads are in really good condition. So the humidity in the air has yet to rise sufficiently for them to start to rot. And they are dry, they're really dry. And that is exactly the moment to harvest every single one that you can see and hang them upside down somewhere, maybe in a pillowcase if you've only got a few, and then the seeds drop right quite neatly down into the pillowcase, or perhaps a big brown paper bag, like a potato bag or something, or a Hessian bag. But we tend to hang them upside down and allow the seed to drop out and then hoover it up once a week or so in the barn here. And drying them like that means that you will have them for Christmas. And sort of from the middle of November, I start preparing my alliums and I take them down. And in the old days, I used to use aerosol spray paint, but I don't do that now because I just worry about the environmental impact of aerosols. And so I dip them in either food colouring, or perhaps I might make up some powder paint in a bucket of a sort of grey with perhaps some sort of silvery tones in it. Or I get emulsion from a paint shop and I dip them in and then hang them outside to dry and drip onto newspaper underneath. And so that's a very sustainable way of colouring your alliums. And then I use them as Christmas decorations. And we have an inglenut fireplace here, which doesn't have a fire surround, it just has a beam going across the top. And every year I string 3 or 4 silver birch branches and I then just attach with ribbon or a little bit of wire or twine my alliums onto that. And then I lace through lots and lots of fairy lights and perhaps some lovely dried straw flowers and into chains. And then I decorate them with light decorations, so not big, heavy decorations, but just tiny mini decorations. And that is my horizontal Christmas tree, well away from the flame of the fire, of course, with an inglenook, but really making our little cozy, sort of snug sitting room here feel very, very glamorous and twinkly and Christmassy. And alliums are the absolute mainstay of a natural Christmas. Couldn't be without them. And don't chuck them. So just like your Christmas decorations, when you get them down from the tree or wherever you use them, wrap your allium decorations that you've treated with the paint in tissue paper and store them in the attic or the cellar or the barn or wherever, or your potting shed or garage, and get them out again next year. And we now have 15 or 20 Schubertii that I've gathered over the years. And honestly, if you wrap them individually, they really will last for decades. So alliums are the way to go. And of course, we're coming up to autumn, which is the time for planting. So I'm always on for new ones, saw some new ones at Chelsea, which we'll be trialling. But I hope that gives you some ideas for a few new ones to trial. Thanks so much for listening to me, Sarah Raven, and Grow Cookie to Range. And I hope you found my allium recap interesting. Next week, I'm joined by somebody who I've known for quite a while through horticulture, Tom Brown, who is the head gardener at Westdean, and he was the head gardener at Parham House, both in West Sussex. Both of them have the most incredible historic greenhouses. And actually, he's just written a book that was out this spring called The Greenhouse Book, which is not about grand, incredible, stately home greenhouses or country house greenhouses, but much more about the greenhouse in your own domestic back garden. So join me chatting to Tom next week. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.